Okay, so on a much more serious note, I mentioned earlier a story that had been kind of haunting me. It's a story that broke this past week about that. I'm at a loss for words, but that individual who killed 9 people in a church in Charleston, South Carolina. And I know this might only seem like it vaguely has anything to do with religion because it more on the surface seems like a straightforward hate crime, or I don't know if we would call it a spree killing or whatever. I don't know if you can call it a spree killing if it's so premeditated and the targets were so specific or whatever. I don't know. But definitely a hate crime. And there's a couple of different aspects I want to discuss about this story. But to me, it ties into religion in a couple of different ways. In a really superficial way, it ties in because obviously it happened at a church. And then on a deeper level, I think it kind of touches on the differences between how maybe a religious person responds to tragedies as opposed to maybe how a secular person might react to a tragedy. And I'll get into that in a little bit, but I'll just read the opening paragraph from a Huffington Post story that broke today. And this is Saturday, June 20th, as I'm reading this, and this story is from this Saturday. And it opens with a website surfaced on Saturday containing a possible trove of photos of Dylan Roof. And I almost didn't mention his name, but I did. And a racist manifesto explaining why he allegedly targeted Charleston, South Carolina in a shooting this week that killed 9 African Americans. The website The Last Rhodesian. I don't even know what that's about. That's very strange. The Last Rhodesian. And I was going to cast some kind of aspersion. I was going to guess, is this some kind of weird white separatist website that has something to do with racial strife in South Africa, something like that? I have no idea. But I actually just tried to open the site twice from 2 different devices, and maybe they took it down. But the first thing that dawned on me when I heard about this story and I saw the first picture that broke of the killer was, and this will probably sound humorous or comedic, but in my mind it really wasn't. I remember I was filled with loathing and disdain for this guy, and I was kind of creeped out by how much at first glance he reminded me of the Sandy Hook killer because of his ridiculous bowl cut. Both guys had this kind of Mo from Three Stooges bowl cut, and whereas the Sandy Hook killer just looked totally out there, like blank face, staring right through you, this guy looks more filled with hate. But they both look like they're in the same age group. If I remember correctly, I think this guy was 21 or something like that. And there's lots of kind of creepy but almost pathetic, laughable pictures of him. He looks like he's probably 90 pounds soaking wet or something, like as scrawny as you can be, but he's trying to kind of look macho for the camera, and there's pictures of him trying to look intimidating, burning flags, trying to, shoot daggers at the camera with his eyes. One where, he's showing off his pipe cleaner arms and he's wearing a Gold's Gym shirt or whatever. And so whenever I hear about a story like this, I don't know why, because I know better, I automatically assume that the person is going to be stupid or crazy. But actually, as is often the case, this guy, like many other loners who commit horrific acts, are often fairly intelligent. And I was kind of wondering, if maybe like the Sandy Hook shooter, if this guy had some kind of weird form of autism or something like that. And I feel bad saying that because I don't want to cast aspersions or slander people with autism, when obviously there's a wide spectrum of types of autism people have and degrees of it. And I don't think most autistic people are violent. It's actually probably quite the opposite. People with certain types of autism might hurt themselves and things like that, but they don't go off and commit murders. But I think, if I remember correctly, I think the Sandy Hook kid had some kind of autism. But like I said, the effects of different types of autism can vary greatly. You can have people that have types of autism and are functional and independent, like Mark Zuckerberg, I think, has Asperger's or something like that. And then you can have people who are completely lost in their own inner world and can't even communicate, you know? But I'm not trying to whatever the Sandy Hook kid did, I'm not trying to blame that on whatever illness he had. That kid, what he did was premeditated. He was obviously filled with a lot of hate. He wanted to kill. But this guy, he left that manifesto on that site, Last Rhodesian or whatever it said. And typos and offensive content aside, I mean, it's actually fairly well written, or well written enough where you can say this kid had at least an average, if not maybe slightly higher than average IQ. But it goes to show that there's a difference between intelligence and wisdom. You know, someone can be book smart or they can be academically gifted, but they might be very ignorant in other ways in regards to maybe moral issues, in regards to people's feelings and how to treat people, just frankly in matters of common sense. So that's the feeling I get when I read this kid's manifesto. He's not stupid, but just profoundly ignorant and misguided. And I'll read just a little bit from this kid's manifesto, not too much, because obviously, I mean, he doesn't deserve it. But see, so he says in one paragraph, I was not raised in a racist home or environment. Living in the South, almost every white person has a small amount of racial awareness, simply because of the numbers of Negroes in this part of the country. But it is a superficial awareness. Growing up in school, the white and black kids would make racial jokes towards each other, but all they were jokes. Me and white friends would sometimes, and there's some, his writing's kind of littered with typos or whatever, but me and white friends would sometimes, and then there's a redundant would, watch things that would make us think that blacks were the real racist and other elementary thoughts like this, but there was no real understanding behind it. And then he says, then the event that truly awakened me was the Trayvon Martin case. I kept hearing and seeing his name, and eventually I decided to look him up. I read the Wikipedia article, and right away I was unable to understand what the big deal was. It was obvious that Zimmerman was in the right. So you can see, I mean, I'm not saying that the kid is some grand intellectual or gifted writer, but it's more than I expected from him. He can actually string sentences together and make a fairly coherent paragraph. And obviously he has a kind of inner life where he really thinks about things a lot, etc. So it almost reminds me of that. You know, it's fun. I think most of us when we're young, generally people think of idealism as a good thing. You know, it's good to have ideals. It's good to be idealistic. But there's a kind of idealism that we often embrace in our youth that makes us cringe when we look back on it later in life. And I'm guilty of that too, where we discover maybe a new philosophy or a new worldview or some kind of cause or something like that, and we embrace it whole hog and try to shove it down other people's throats and act in this really kind of overzealous way or whatever. And it almost seems like this guy just consumed a lot of racist garbage online and then just drank that Kool-Aid and then became very idealistic about trying to act on this ideology, this racist ideology he had developed or discovered. And the thing about, obviously it's offensive to me. I mean, the Zimmerman, the Trayvon Martin Zimmerman thing was a really hot button issue that stayed in the headlines for a long time. And it was very controversial and divisive. And none of us were there, so none of us know exactly what happened that night. But I'll just say, frankly, I'm one of the people that leans towards the Trayvon Martin side. Because at the end of the day, it is true none of us know exactly what happened. I remember for a long time, no one knew who it was screaming on the audio recording. Was it Trayvon Martin screaming while he was being kind of brutalized by George Zimmerman? Or was it George Zimmerman screaming for help after he had confronted Trayvon Martin and Trayvon Martin decided he was going to try to whoop him or whatever, you know? And the last I heard, I think that was what people were tending to go to, that Zimmerman was armed. He approached Trayvon Martin, and maybe Trayvon Martin wasn't going to be a little pushover, and he decided that if George Zimmerman was going to try to start something or get in his way, that he was going to kick his ass or something. And then maybe George Zimmerman realized he bit off more he could chew, and maybe he started to get his ass kicked by Trayvon Martin and then started screaming like a baby or whatever and ended up shooting the kid. But whatever you think happened with George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin, the one thing that I always keep in mind at the end of the day, the one thing that always sways me in the end is that we had two people, Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman. Trayvon Martin's father and maybe his father's girlfriend or his Trayvon Martin's, I think it was the father's girlfriend. I was almost going to say stepmother or something. But they lived in that neighborhood. And I don't know if it was some kind of gated or closed community or something like that. But Trayvon Martin had just bought Skittles and iced tea, I think it was, and he was on his way home because I think he was visiting his father. So you have a kid who's unarmed. He's got the Skittles, the iced tea. I think George Zimmerman tried to say that Trayvon Martin might have been behaving suspiciously and that maybe he was cutting through backyards, and so he thought he might, was planning to try to steal something or break into a place or something like that. To be honest with you, it's been so long since I've looked at the facts of the case, I don't know if Trayvon Martin was cutting through backyards or not. I don't even remember. But then when I think about when I was a kid and I was returning home from the town center, from the local convenience store, I would cut through people's yards, whatever way was the easiest to get back home, But anyway, so you have an unarmed kid, still a high school student, I believe, just came back from the convenience store on the way home or to his father's house where he's staying. Then we have a grown-ass man, George Zimmerman, who's in a car. And he's part of the neighborhood watch, I guess. And he seems to be the type of guy that likes to play cop. He likes to... there is a Second Amendment, so, you're allowed to carry a gun. And there are, I imagine, I hope, a lot of responsible gun owners out there, So I'm not trying to disparage him just because he was carrying a gun. But he does seem to be one of these guys that... Let's say he gets kind of a confidence boost from having a gun. And he had this kind of wannabe cop mentality. And he was in the car, he called the cops, and the dispatcher, and supposedly people sympathetic to Zimmerman say, well, just because the dispatcher told him to stay in his car or not to engage the individual doesn't mean that he had to obey that. That wasn't, a legal command from an officer or something like that. But I'm thinking, okay, even if it wasn't an officer you're talking to a dispatcher or whoever the heck it was, they took your complaint and they advised you that the smart thing to do was not to engage the person, not to get out of your car. So we have a young kid. Once again, father lives in the neighborhood. As far as we know, he's just on his way home. We have a grown man in a car who could have stayed in that car and waited for the cops to arrive. But instead, he gets out. Somehow the two of them meet, and Trayvon Martin ends up dead. So to me, if George Zimmerman had just kept his fat ass in the car and waited for the cops, there'd be a kid who had his whole life ahead of him still alive. And we know that even after the fact, trouble has just followed Zimmerman. This guy cannot stay out of the news. He cannot stay out of legal trouble. He cannot stay out of gang trouble for how he handles his firearms, etc. Yeah, but this kid's manifesto continues, and he basically gives a breakdown of a bunch of different racial types or whatever. He spends the most time talking about blacks and why he doesn't like them. He tries to justify his feelings in kind of like a pseudo-intellectual way or pseudo-scientific way. Then he thinks Jews are really mostly white, but he doesn't like them either. He's a little bit more sympathetic for Hispanics because he thinks a lot of them have white blood. Really likes East Asians for some reason. I have great respect for the East Asian races. Even if we were to go extinct, they could carry something on. They are by nature very racist. That's why I guess he likes them. And could be great allies of the white race. I am not opposed at all to allies with the Northern Asian races. Or maybe he means to being allied with the Northeast Asian races. And so obviously when you hear about a story like this, it makes you think about the concept of quote-unquote race. And I hate the term race, and I actually try not to use it. Because I think there are those basic, what I would call pseudo, or at least somewhat pseudo-scientific racial classifications we're all probably familiar with, like Caucasian, Negroid, Mongoloid, etc. And I would say maybe like in the 19th century, there was a lot of work where people tried to break races into, or where people tried to divide humanity into different racial classifications. And it can be tricky because obviously there are superficial physical differences between different ethnic groups or whatever. And I think sometimes religious people try to demonize science as if it's all cold and empirical, which in a way it is, fortunately, and that's what we love about it. It's about facts, evidence, observation, But also I think science can actually reinforce some of our moral insights. And I think a good example is race. For a long time, racists want us to believe that people really were physiologically different, and that some groups were subhuman or inferior to others. But even I was going to say if they're religious, maybe they think that God, designated these different racial groups or whatever. But even that doesn't make sense, because if you're a Christian, and often a lot of racist Christians are also fundamentalists who believe in the Bible literally, or at least believe in many prominent parts of the Bible literally, like Genesis and the story of Adam and Eve. So if the world started out with two people, aren't we all related despite our skin color? But anyway, I think modern science through genetics has shown us that we really are one species. But I think when you have isolated gene pools, or you have groups that are living in disparate parts of the world, over time, they do develop superficial physical traits, say differences in eye and skin color and hair type, that are kind of adaptations to help one live more ideally in their specific climate. For instance, human life originated in Africa. And Africa, because of the extreme sun and heat, it's more beneficial to have skin that's dark and packed with melanin. And not only does melanin help protect us from the sun to some degree, but it's also what determines skin pigment. So you have people with dark skin, you have people with kind of tight, kinkier hair, because it provides a certain degree of ventilation, etc. And then when people migrated into Europe, and to the really, the colder or cooler climes, you ended up with people who didn't need as much melanin in their skin. So you end up with a decreased amount of skin pigmentation. You end up with people who have lighter eyes and hair and skin, and the hair doesn't need to be as kinky anymore to help cool the person off, to help cool the scalp off or whatever. So you end up with straighter hair. So there are these superficial differences, and sometimes there's genetic illnesses that people of a specific group are more predisposed to, like sickle cell with people of African descent, or Tay-Sachs with Ashkenazi Jews, etc. But if you think about it, and I know some people find this offensive, but since I love dogs, I don't, and I recognize the fact that we are animals. I like to use dogs as a good analogy. I have a Chihuahua that's, she's like 13 pounds, but she's fat. She should be lighter or whatever. No, actually, she's 16 pounds, but she's lost weight, but her target weight is 13 pounds. But Chihuahuas can be much smaller than that. So, you can have like a 6-pound Chihuahua. Then you can have this gigantic, like, Great Dane or Mastiff or like Irish Wolfhound or something like that. And you can have these animals that look incredibly different, that they look like they don't even belong to the same species. But genetically, they are the same exact species. They might be predisposed to different hereditary illnesses because of overbreeding, or because of isolated gene pools and small populations or whatever. And they might have vastly different physical traits, like a pushed-in pug nose compared to, say, the long wolfish snout of like a Doberman or a German Shepherd or something. And this is just because of breeding too. But under the surface, they're the same species. And I think that's the same with humans, where we have these little differences in superficial physical traits that we've developed over time because of isolated kind of gene pools or whatever. But underneath it, still the same exact species. I think I once heard a scientist say, now after getting that table leg thing wrong, I'm trying to watch what I say by quoting documentaries from, or paraphrasing documentaries from memory, but something to the effect of that there's more differences genetically between two members of the same family than there are between two different quote-unquote racial groups or ethnic groups. That's how closely we're all related. Out of Africa, man, out of Africa. So I'm just disgusted by these stories of racial hatred. And like I said, I think in this, want me to be nerdy and quote Dungeons and Dragons for a minute or whatever, but I remember when I was a little kid and I would play paper and pencil Dungeons and Dragons with the older kids in the neighborhood. Or it might have been when in high school, for a brief time, I think it was, I went back to playing Dungeons and Dragons. And I remember the popular kids who I was friends with kind of frowned on that. But hey, what are you gonna do? It was a fun game, man. And I still play DDO online even now. It kind of reminds me of World of Warcraft, except it's Dungeons and Dragons. I was actually playing that this morning. How nerdy am I? But anyway, there's a bunch of different attributes in Dungeons and Dragons when you're making a character, like strength, dexterity, charisma, things like that. And two of them are intelligence and wisdom. And they used to say that intelligence is knowing that it's raining. Wisdom is knowing to get out of the rain. And there I am quoting Dungeons and Dragons while trying to make a moral point. But I actually think that's beautifully put in a way. And it just goes to show that there is a difference between intelligence and wisdom. You can have someone that is maybe book smart to a degree, or they're not the dullest knife in the draw, like this kid here. I don't know how much education he had or how well he did in school, but he was relatively articulate and thoughtful. And I hate saying that because it sounds like I'm praising him. But he was also very ignorant and misguided and definitely didn't possess a lick of wisdom. And these racist types, it's like, I don't get it. As one person said on TV, that some of these people he killed, these 9 black people, some of them most likely had ancestry that went back further in this country, that went back further than his own, because slaves arrived here so early. So it's like, I hate saying we, because one thing that I do kind of agree on is that there can sometimes be, and even I feel it sometimes, the quote unquote white guilt. Even though, like I said, I'm mostly Italian, like 50%, both my grandfathers were Italian. My grandmother's people were from County Cork, Ireland, which at the time, not a very privileged place, and I'm not sure, but I would imagine that her family probably came here like many other Irish to escape poverty or famine or whatever. And then I'm not sure of the exact ancestry of my other grandmother, but it might have been like English and French Canadian. So who knows? Maybe if you dug far enough, you might find some slaveholders. But I largely identify as Italian American and then Irish American. St. Patrick's Day is a fairly big thing in my family, as is Columbus Day. But so it's like most of my ancestors probably didn't come over here till like the Ellis Island period. They weren't slave owners. So sometimes I think there is a point when people talk about white guilt and how that all of us, if we have white skin, are somehow guilty for the sins of the past in this country. But that being said, I use we generally, speaking as an American, and speaking as if we all own the past of this country as Americans, So in that sense, speaking kind of figuratively, whatever you could say, we dragged all these slaves here. And then what? Now you're not happy that they're here, so you're going to try to kill them all or drive them away. And like the good point that was made that I just referenced, when there's a lot of black people whose ancestry in this country predates that of a lot of white Americans who might be, I don't know, they could be of German or, Irish descent or whatever, people who immigrated after the colonization, kind of like I was talking about in that Ellis Island period, or they could be Polish, they could be whatever. Yeah, so the whole racist thing, it doesn't make sense to me on so many different levels. It doesn't make sense morally. It doesn't make sense scientifically. And this stupid kid just threw his whole life away. I mean, what do you think he was going to prove murdering 9 innocent people? And it's too bad the kid didn't get turned on to some more positive ideology, or maybe that the kid wasn't exposed more to basic facts about genetic science and human evolution, where he'd be able to see that we are all the same species, Homo sapiens. But anyway, so here's where a kind of a religious element comes into play. So one thing that stuck with me, and maybe I heard it in the news today or yesterday, is that already, man, I mean, like, or as maybe as early as like a day or two after this thing or whatever, some of the family members of some of the victims were already, through tears and grief, saying that they forgive this guy and are saying things like, God have mercy on your soul, I forgive you, things like that. And it reminded me of Hitchens, my hero, Christopher Hitchens. And I don't call many people my hero or refer to people as heroes of mine. And some people, when you call someone who actually didn't fight in a war or, rescue a child from a burning building, will say, well, that's not a real hero. But I think you can have intellectual heroes, or heroes who are activists, or heroes who are thinkers or philosophers or whatever. But Christopher Hitchens is one of my personal heroes for a number of reasons. For his wit, for his bravery and not being afraid to say what he thinks, for his oratory skills, for his sheer eloquence and his abilities as a gifted writer. I don't think and here I'm being a hypocrite because I often talk about how I don't want to be considered part of any specific community because I don't want to get kind of poisoned by groupthink. So I sometimes will even say that I don't even necessarily consider myself a part of any atheist community, but I'll be a bit of a hypocrite, and I'll say that I think that we non-believers, we atheists or whatever, we experienced a real loss when Hitchens passed, not just because someone that we loved and admired passed away, a real live human being, because a great kind of champion of the cause passed away too. I don't think there's any atheist speaker out there right now, or free thought proponent or anything, that's as charming, witty, intelligent, and has that unique ability to be simultaneously strident and eloquent at the same time, you know? There's no one who can fill Hitchens' shoes out there. You know, Matt Dillahunty and the rest of them, get out of here. But I'm not taking that back. It's probably controversial. Who cares? No, there's no one like Hitchens now. But anyway, I mean, I think some of the other so-called horsemen are good, like Dennett, Harris, Dawkins, of course. But none of them have the whole package like Hitchens did. As charming and as witty as Dawkins can be, he still doesn't. He has his own kind of je ne sais quoi, but he doesn't have the same je ne sais quoi that Hitchens had. But anyway, so back on topic. I remember, anyone who's a fan of Hitchens will remember this. He, in many of his talks, he used to say, he had this challenge: name me one good deed or moral action that only a religious person could do that a non-believer couldn't. And then he would also say, think of an evil or wicked action that only a religious person could commit. And he'd kind of jokingly say to the audience, and, you know, I'm sure you've already thought of one, and what often comes to my mind is like human sacrifice. You'd probably have to get really philosophical and figurative to try to say that atheists employ human sacrifice. People might bring up maybe the war machine of a communist government or something like that. But anyway, so it made me think of Hitchens' challenge when I heard some of these people who had just lost their family members already forgiving the killer. And I was thinking that this impulse to forgive is probably largely fueled by religion, by Christian doctrine. You know, that you're supposed to forgive everyone or whatever, and that eventually justice will be served through God or whatever. So this isn't to try to diminish them or their kind of magnanimous attitude, which I do admire in a way. But if you think about it, and here I am, as always, being overly analytical, I think at the end of the day, though, that response to forgive someone who did you or a loved one this heinous wrong, you know, this grotesque moral transgression, in this case, forgiving someone who took the life of your loved one, I think, although on the surface it seems to come from this place of divine generosity or grace or something like that, when you think about it, I think at the end of the day it's about catharsis. In a way, forgiving the person is kind of more about you than the person you're forgiving, because if you hold on to that anger, if you hold on to that hate, if you hold on to that pain, it'll just eat you up day after day and emotionally destroy you, you know? But I guess first off, is that a good act? Is forgiving someone who did something wicked, especially something of that caliber, murdering an innocent person, is that good? I think at first blush we think of it as good. And hopefully I'm not coming off as unsympathetic to the families of the victims, because my sympathy is definitely with them. It sure as hell isn't with that kid who murdered 9 innocent people. But I just think this is kind of an interesting topic to explore, and hopefully it's not, as they say, too soon, you know? But I remember thinking for a moment, I'm like, does this fit the criteria of the Hitchens challenge? Could a secular person be so quick to forgive someone for such a heinous transgression? Is this the type of thing you could only do if you believe in God? You know, because if you believe in God, this big judge in the sky who's going to make sure everything works out in the end, and that the bad people are punished, the good people are rewarded, you know, in the next life. You know, if you buy into that, if you buy into that it's God's job to judge ultimately and not ours, so, you know, we're all sinners, so we should forgive other people no matter how bad their sins are. There's all this theology tied up in that. Do you have to be a religious person to forgive someone for their transgressions? And is that a good? I don't know if it's a good thing to forgive people for wicked acts. I think it's good in a way for the victim or the families of the victimized. I think anything that helps a victim or their families pick up the broken pieces and somehow slog on and move forward with their lives is good. As someone whose heart breaks for victims, anything they can do to put their lives back together and move. I hate saying move on, because moving on always, it seems to tacitly imply leaving, you know, the dead behind. But I think, you know, you should obviously I don't believe in life after death, or I at least greatly doubt it. But I think we should honor the dead and figuratively keep them with us. So in that sense, I never really liked the term move on. But, you know, be able to be a functional human being again. And if forgiving the monster that hurt you or your loved one or took their life helps you to move on, to move forward, then that's all right with me. But is it a good thing morally? I don't know. It might be a good thing morally in the sense that helps you find some measure of solace and remain functional for your remaining family, etc., you know? But could a secular person, could a non-believer like myself do the same thing? And I was giving this a lot of thought. And I think actually, I don't know if I could, but I think in theory a non-believer could. Because at the end of the day, like I was saying, I think it's about catharsis. It's more about catharsis than anything. It's about learning to let go of your anger and hate and grief enough to go on with life. And so even someone who doesn't believe in a higher power, who doesn't believe in some kind of cosmic justice, you still might reach a point where you're like, I don't like holding on to all this anger and hate and resentment, and I have to forgive the person that victimized me or that stole the life of my loved one, and I don't know, maybe see them as a fellow human being who did something awful, but be able to see the humanity in them, forgive them, and go on. I think a non-believer could do that. I don't know if I could. And, you know, because I guess I largely tend to think of myself as someone who holds humanist values. But at the same time, I sometimes almost feel cavemanish because I still sometimes justify things like capital punishment and retribution and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And that's actually something I almost set up another interview with Anonymous Steve. It was almost going to take place this weekend, but I think he had kind of a hectic weekend. But and what I love about Steve is that it doesn't matter how much we disagree about something, we never get ugly or antagonistic about it. I think, as what I like to believe, is two good-natured thoughtful individuals who also happen to have, kind of silly senses of humor or whatever, we're able to kind of happily explore any subject matter without taking it personally and wagging our fingers at one another. And I really love that. I think people, even if they have opposing viewpoints, should be able to explore those ideas enthusiastically and with a kind of good-natured zest instead of turning it into a pissing match or getting angry with one another. But Steve and I disagree to some degree with capital punishment. I know that, but this time around, actually, now that I think about it, it was the use of the word terrorist. I'm pretty much pro use of the word terrorist. I just think it's basically an apt descriptor at the end of the day. And if jackasses at like Fox News use it in a racist way or they use it out of context, we should hold them accountable for that, but that doesn't mean that we have to ban the word from the lexicon. If we got rid of every word that other people use incorrectly or unjustly, we'd be shedding words all the time or whatever. I think terrorist is a good description for someone that commits an act of violence against innocence, in the name of religion or political agenda with the goal of kind of frightening or demoralizing the other side, blowing up bombs in a public place, sawing the heads off of bound hostages, threatening the lives of cartoonists. That's terrorism to me. I don't care what the religion or ethnicity involved is. It's terror. It's terrorism, just like bombing an abortion clinic is an act of terrorism, just like Timothy McVeigh in the Oklahoma bombing. Then that's terrorism. But I know Steve and I differ on that. He thinks that terrorism is kind of a conversation stopper. And, it's just this kind of inflammatory word that doesn't do anyone any good. And what I love about Steve is the way that even if I don't necessarily see eye to eye with him, he's able to deliver his opinion in such a thoughtful and intelligent and rational way that you almost want to see it from his way, even if you don't, because it can sometimes be hard to argue with his reason. Or his sense of logic on these issues. But what the hell was I talking about? Oh yeah, the death penalty. My main issue with the death penalty is that there's always the grotesque possibility of an innocent person being put to death. And usually we want to put someone to death for committing some almost unspeakable atrocity. Like if it's I always use the Pettit family from Connecticut as an example, and I don't want to go through it in gruesome detail again, but this was a family that was victimized in just about every way possible, resulting in the death, the burning alive of the two daughters and the mother. So often when we talk about wanting to put someone to death, it's for committing some type of moral atrocity, and but I think another absolutely heinous, almost unspeakable moral atrocity would be accidentally putting an innocent man to death. And that's why I think we have to be so careful when it comes to capital punishment. And it's kind of scary when you hear about these people who've been sitting on death row, and luckily for them, new DNA evidence turns up, or some other type of evidence turns up that vindicates them before they actually, were brought to the gas chamber or the electric chair or strapped down for a lethal injection or whatever. I mean, But the people who raped and murdered, the Pettit family, only, the husband was left alive. The two daughters, one of the daughters, the younger of the two, was raped. The mother was raped. The father was beaten and chained to a pole in the basement. And then the house was set on fire with the mother and the two daughters inside. And very, very sadly, they didn't make it. So I would totally be for, but like, let's say we knew with 100% certainty, like I think we do with these two guys, the two guys that committed that crime. We know they did it, If you know with 100% certainty that someone committed an atrocity like that, I have no problem putting those guys to death. Would I be able to personally put them to death? If I was there getting ready to pull the metaphorical switch or or literally pull the switch, depending on what type of execution we're talking about, would I look at them and suddenly, no matter how small, see some spark of humanity in them that made me second guess my willingness to put them to death? I don't know, but at least as an armchair philosopher, the idea of people being put to death for crimes like that doesn't bother me. But if we had to vote on the death penalty, I would give serious thought to voting against it, just because I was so concerned about the idea of an innocent person being put to death. But, in principle, I don't have a problem with someone, as I sit here today, being put to death for some kind of atrocity like that. But yeah, it does give you pause, because as a human being, you realize, even if you're just philosophizing on a podcast, you realize the weight, the responsibility that your words carry when you're even just talking on a little podcast like this about when someone should or shouldn't be put to death by the government. I mean, that's heavy stuff, And that reminds me of how, I live in the greater Boston area. On a good day, I can reach the city of Boston in probably 15 minutes or less if the traffic on the highway is clear or whatever. And what was it, a few weeks back, not only did they find Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, one of the brothers who committed the Boston Marathon bombing or perpetrated it, whatever. I think the rum's getting to me. But shortly after, the jury voted for the death penalty. And I remember I was kind of hoping he would get the death penalty. I mean, I just despise the two of these guys so bad, I probably can't even say some of the things I had kind of fantasized about happening to them, because people would want to lock me up in a loony bin or call me some kind of wild sadist or something. But then I remember when they announced it on the news, when you hear this loud, sober voice on the local news saying sentenced to death, you're like, whoa, just got real. The state or whatever, the government's going to actually kill someone. And then I remember what he did. I remember they put the pressure cooker bombs down on the ground where they would tear off, scores of limbs or whatever. And they, it might have been Dzhokhar Tsarnaev that put the pressure cooker down that, in the backpack or whatever, that killed the young boy. 3 people died. A little boy died. I think he was like 8 or something. And I feel bad out of respect for the families and the victims that maybe I'm not remembering correctly from memory. But it's kind of sad. I just took up my iPad and started typing in Boston Marathon into the Wikipedia app on here. And before I was even done typing marathon, the first thing that comes up, Boston Marathon bombing. Or one of the first things. Okay, so here it is. 3 spectators were killed in the bombing. Crystal Marie Campbell, 29, a restaurant manager from Medford, Massachusetts. And I'm often in Medford, Massachusetts. It's actually one of my brothers lives, and we do a lot of work there, doing construction and things like that. Lu Lingzi, 23, a Chinese national and Boston University graduate student from Shenyang. and Martin William Richard, an 8-year-old boy from the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston, who was killed by the second bomb. On April 18th at about 10:48 p.m., Sean A. Collier, 27, an MIT police officer, formerly with the Somerville Auxiliary Police Department. I actually used to live in Somerville. And he was of Wilmington, Massachusetts. And I actually know people from Wilmington. And he was living in Somerville at the time. But then I bring it back. And like I said, when you hear this loud, sober voice on the radio saying someone's just been sentenced to death, it's heavy. A fellow human being is going to be put to death. But then when I remember who that excuse for a human being is and what they did, then I still feel the weight of it. That is a part of a society. When you look at a society as a whole, that we've decided we're going to put someone to death for doing something wicked. I don't necessarily have a problem with it. And when I hear about people who commit these wicked acts, that's what my mind kind of goes towards. Now that's someone who deserves the death penalty. But you still feel the moral weight of the decision, But anyway, I can't believe I've been at this for almost 2 hours now. My guess is, going by experience, by the time that I trim this down, we're probably looking at an 1.5 hour long episode. So I will call it quits for now. Yep, Facebook, Twitter, subscribe or rate the show through iTunes. Go to Podbean, look for The Week in Doubt, check out the archives going all the way back to the first episode. You can also donate to the show via PayPal at Podbean. And now Podbean has this big green patron button too. It's kind of like Patreon, but it's right within Podbean. So if you'd like to become a patron and donate to the show, you can do that. And who knows, maybe I should set up a goal there for like equipment or something. You can also donate to the show via Patreon. If you're already a Patreon supporter or whatever, don't feel like you have to do both Podbean and Patreon. One is more than fine, and I'm so grateful to you guys whenever you help in any way. So let's see. I think that's it for now. So until next week, thanks for listening.